Welcome to our second episode, I think it is at this point, second episode of Know Your Rights in Private Rented. Last week we covered specifically the emergency legislation of COVID and basically how that is protecting tenants at the moment. We're going to be moving towards a more general Know Your Rights. So this doesn't have anything to do with COVID legislation. This is just the general legislation that stands in Ireland for tenants. So I guess initially when we were doing the COVID video, it was quite long, like it went on for nearly 45 minutes because I feel there was a lot to cover in detail in that, and it was quite important that we did get that out. When we went to record this, we were going to do a kind of Know Your Rights, just one big video, but again there is so much in the legislation. I mean, you've got rent increases, you have termination notices, tenant obligations and rights, landlord obligations and rights, housing maintenance. So I think what we're going to do is basically just take a topic at a time, and hopefully when like we piece it together, that, or even when people are going through it, that it kind of makes sense. I'm just going to start off today with the very basics of what is a tenancy, and then the types of tenancy as well. Also around the application of the Residential Tenancies Act and the exemptions as well. Like I said before, please do contact us. We have our contact details here. That's our email, and that's my email, Aisling@Icon Network. We have our office number and then the mobile number as well. If you have any questions or you want us to elaborate on anything, or you maybe are in a circumstance of your own that you're seeking advice for, well, that's totally fine. Like, get in contact and we will try to assist you, or if not, signpost you to where you need to go. Also, all our presentations endeavour to be as factual as possible. If you see any discrepancies or mishaps in what we're saying, like, we really welcome feedback. So again, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. For some reason, okay, for some reason my arrows on the keyboard aren't working, but they are on screen. So basically, your rights as a tenant come from various landlord and tenant legislation. We won't be covering, we won't be able to cover all of them in detail. We'll take very specific parts of the legislation or key parts of the legislation at like one piece at a time. So again, this week we're covering tenancies, and the Residential Tenancies Act is kind of the main act that really sets out tenancies in Ireland and what a private residential tenancy actually is. So this here is the Residential Tenancies Act 2004. So that's the main body of legislation. And then it has been amended, or changes have been made in 2015 and 2019. And we'll be discussing a little bit of that to come. So when it comes to the application of the Residential Tenancies Act, so basically what it applies to, every dwelling that is subject of a private residential tenancy is going to come under the Residential Tenancies Act. So if you're paying rent to a landlord, whether that's your own rent or whether you're getting housing support, or your own income, or whether you're getting housing support, well, you're probably going to be governed by the Residential Tenancies Act, and you will have rights within that act. So generally it covers tenancies that are under social housing support, such as housing assistance payment, rental accommodation scheme, so RAS, and rent supplement. Now those, I know like some people think, oh, but like HAP is social housing, but HAP is essentially a payment to people or a housing support to people in private rented accommodation. So not to kind of get confused, it is quite different to, say, local authority or public housing dwellings. Each of those payments, housing assistance payment, rental accommodation scheme, and rent supplement, basically they can't take away from your rights in the Residential Tenancies Act, like you are a private residential tenant, basically. So they are more so an assistance to you to help you pay rent. Also, the Residential Tenancies Act, as of 2015, it actually came into play in 2016. A lot of setups with approved housing bodies or housing associations are now coming under the Residential Tenancies Act. So housing associations have been brought under this legislation, which means if you're with an approved housing body or housing association, you will have rights as a tenant under the Residential Tenancies Act. And then in 2019, student-specific tenancies came under the Residential Tenancies Act as well. So before 2019, students were more so seen as licensee agreements, and they had very limited rights. And as of 2019, the Residential Tenancies Act is going to cover student-specific tenancies. Now, there are some exemptions, so that the Residential Tenancies Act doesn't necessarily wholly cover student-specific tenancies, particularly when it comes to Part 4, which we're going to be discussing later. And that's what we say down the end here. When it comes to security of tenure and terminating a tenancy, there are some differences in how the legislation is applied to some housing association setups and student-specific tenancies. And we will get to that in a little bit. That'll start making more sense as we go on. So maybe if I just move this, I don't know now in the video if that is actually going to move over, but there we go. So when we talk about exemptions, so basically where the Act does not apply, the Residential Tenancies Act will not apply to the following dwellings. So local authority or council, city council or county council homes, the Residential Tenancies Act will not apply. And the reason for that is that they're just covered by different legislation. If you're living in a local authority dwelling, you are going to be covered by the Housing Miscellaneous Act. You're not seen as a private rented tenant, so therefore you will not have rights under the Residential Tenancies Act. Your rights are going to come in under the Housing Miscellaneous Act. And hopefully down the line, we will be able to cover some videos around local authority provision. For now, we're just going to try and tick off private rented. If you are in a holiday home or a kind of short-term letting, that is more so going to be like a licensee agreement rather than a tenancy. So the idea is that you aren't necessarily living there, or you don't have what's called exclusive occupation of the dwelling. Well, then you may be seen in those circumstances in holiday homes, the likes of hotels and stuff like that. It's more a licensee agreement. Where you're sharing a house with your landlord, if it's kind of split in two. So if you're renting a room and it's part of your landlord's home, the Residential Tenancies Act will not cover you, and you will not have the same rights. If this is a circumstance that you're in and disputes arise, you won't be able to seek any remedies to the Residential Tenancies Board. Instead, your disputes will go through the small claims court. And because that is a different setup, we will hope to cover in a video that provision, sharing with your landlord. We will hope to get a little snippet out advising people on kind of the setup and their limited rights in those circumstances. But if, for example, then you're renting like in your landlord's home, but the place that you're renting is self-contained, either it's a flat offside or like it's just completely separate to the home. Maybe you could have like a small little flat down the back, or that it's like say 52A or whatever, and A is attached onto the side of the house. If you can prove that you are in a self-contained area and have exclusive occupation of the property, well, then you basically will be covered by the Residential Tenancies Act with some exemptions towards a Part 4 tenancy. And again, we will get to what Part 4 tenancies are in a little bit. For any legal heads, or if you want to kind of read the full bit of the legislation around the exemptions or the full list of the exemptions, you can find that in Section 3 of the Residential Tenancies Act. So what is a tenancy? A tenancy is the agreement between a landlord and a tenant. It's as simple as that. And also that you would have exclusive occupation of the property would determine that you are a private residential tenant even, sorry. So basically, when you rent a home from a private landlord or an approved housing body, you have an agreement or a contract with that person or with that body, or maybe a letting agent, and it's known as a tenancy agreement. Now, a tenancy agreement may or may not be in writing. So often, like, we get phone calls being like, oh, like, I had got I'm having an issue with my landlord and I never signed a lease, or I never signed a tenancy agreement. Like, what do I do? Does that mean I'm a sublet, or does that mean that I don't have rights? If you haven't signed anything, it's okay. It doesn't take away from your rights as a tenant under the Residential Tenancies Act. So tenancy agreements, essentially, with a tenancy agreement, as I was saying, it can be in writing or it might just be implied, as in we just kind of know without necessarily putting it to paper. It might be a verbal agreement between the landlord and the tenant. Both landlords and tenants, like you as a tenant living in a private rented accommodation, you should know exactly what the terms and conditions are of you living there. So, for example, you should know how much rent that you have to pay. You should know when you have to pay that rent, how you pay that rent. You should also know if there's any special conditions on the property, and basically know your implied rights under the Residential Tenancies Act. For this reason, written agreements between landlords and tenants are encouraged because, one, they're binding, which means if a landlord signs a written agreement, they know their obligations, and also the tenant is aware of what's expected of them in that tenancy. But at the same time, don't panic if you haven't signed anything. It doesn't mean that you have no rights, because you will have accumulated rights depending on how long you've lived in the property. So the very basics of a written agreement or lease will include the name of the landlord and the name of the tenant, who are bound normally by the written agreement. The terms of the rent. So as I was saying, it's like, how much rent is the property? When am I expected to pay that rent? So do I pay at the end of the month, the start of the month? Is there a specific date? And also how that rent has to be paid. So is it by cash? Is it by direct debit? Can you do check, standing order, etc.? The terms of the agreement as well. So whether this tenancy is a fixed period or a periodic period, and we will discuss that on the next slide. Special terms and conditions of the tenancy. So special terms and conditions may be included in the lease agreement. It could be something like no pets, or basically that you're not allowed to smoke in the property or whatever like that. Special terms and conditions, as I've said over here, they can't undermine your rights in the Residential Tenancies Act. So you have implied rights by the very nature of being a tenant, you have automatic rights. And a landlord can't put into your lease, say something that would actually undermine or contradict your rights as a tenant. So we will be covering rights as a tenant in greater detail, but just to give a small example, maybe if a landlord writes in the special terms and conditions that he or she is going to come into your property once a week, technically your rights as a tenant under the Residential Tenancies Act is going to overrule those special conditions, because the law would state that the landlord can't enter the property at any time whenever they want. They have to contact you, and they have to basically liaise with you and let you know, and you as a tenant deserve exclusive occupation of the property, so the landlord can't just come and go as he or she pleases. So that would be an example of where the special terms won't stand. Even if you sign a lease and say the landlord has written in the special terms that he or she is going to come into the property every week, and you've signed that and you've agreed to it, it doesn't stand. So in down the line, you can simply say, actually, this goes against my rights as a tenant under the Residential Tenancies Act, and basically, like, you're not accepting it or whatever like that. So always remember that your legal right as a tenant will always overrule any contradictory terms in the lease. Then we have what should also be in a written agreement and a lease is a description of the property and an inventory as well. So a description of the property will include maybe like details of each room, if there's any how would I say, like if there's any wear and tear in the rooms or any structural repairs that are needed, like all of those should be noted in the description of the property. Vice versa, the inventory is going to be a list of items that the landlord has provided you. So the likes of a microwave, like sofas, beds, all of that kind of stuff. And you will both agree that the kind of conditions of the property and the inventory. Another thing to recommend when you move into a property is just take pictures of the property and also the items that are in it, and just email it to yourself. It's handy to have for further reference down the line if there's any disputes around deposits or anything like that. Then the written agreement as well will also have the signatures of the landlord and of the tenant. So as I was saying, you don't have to sign a written lease or a written agreement. There's no legal requirement that a landlord has to provide you a written lease, nor is there an obligation on you as a tenant to sign a lease. And it is important to note that both landlords and tenants have legal rights under the Residential Tenancies Act. If a lease is in place and it's not signed or dated, it's actually worthless. It becomes null void. Signatures acknowledge that the landlord and the tenant agree to the terms of the lease. So the landlord or agent acting on behalf of the landlord must sign and date the lease. The tenants must also sign and date the lease and should be named as parties to the lease. So if you get an agreement or like a written contract or lease and it's not signed and it's not dated, technically it's kind of null void. So that's kind of it on leases. Again, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. But it's important for you guys to note that, like, you can't be forced to sign something that you don't want to sign, and you don't have an obligation to sign a lease. When we're saying lease, normally it's a written tenancy agreement. It's often referred to as a lease or a written tenancy agreement. In terms of collective leases or written agreements, if you sign, this is kind of where there's more than one person living in a property. So if you sign a lease or agreement together with other people in the house, you all equally become responsible for the rent. So there's often been circumstances where, say, for example, it's a 4-bedroom house and you are each paying €400 and the rent is €1,200. One tenant loses their job and can't afford to pay that rent. You guys are all equally liable to pick up the shortfall, essentially. So that's worth noting. And also, if you sign a lease or agreement on your own or on behalf of other tenants, you become responsible for all the rent. So if you're renting a 4-bedroom and it's just you on the lease and another tenant can't afford to pay the rent, if you're the only one on the lease, you are solely responsible for that rent. So that's just important to know. Maybe when you're starting tenancies, it's just a discussion to have with the people that you're sharing a house with. As I was saying, with regards to terms of agreement, so fixed or periodic, we're going to come into the types of tenancies now. So there's 2 common types of tenancies, and they are fixed term tenancy and periodic tenancies. And there's some differences in them that is quite important to note. So if I go to a house viewing and I decide, yeah, I'm going to take that house, and basically I agree with the landlord that I am going to be staying there for a year, basically, and I sign a lease or a written agreement that my fixed term tenancy is for 1 year. That is essentially what fixed term means. It's an agreement between tenant and landlord that lasts for a specific amount of time. It may be for any period. It could be ranging from as little as 6 months up to a year, or even up to 3 or 4 years. It just depends on the agreement that the tenant has with the landlord. With a fixed term tenancy, you can't end the tenancy before the end of the fixed term unless me as a tenant or you as a tenant has breached your tenant obligations, and we'll be covering tenant obligations in a separate video. So that's really important to note. After 6 months, if you're in a fixed term tenancy, you automatically get what is called security of tenure, or Part 4 rights is sometimes what it's also referred to. But you have to claim those Part 4 rights, or you have to claim that security of tenure by writing to the landlord. And we will discuss that in the next slide. Then when it comes to a periodic tenancy, it's if I go to a house and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to rent this house, and the kind of tenancy just starts and I don't sign anything, nor do I agree any period with the landlord as to how long it's going to last. So I'm just kind of in my tenancy and I'm paying my rent month to month, or I could be paying my rent week to week. So the idea is that the periodic tenancy doesn't state a specific time. It doesn't have a fixed length period. The idea is that it just keeps rolling. The period of tenancy may be weekly or monthly, and that's dependent on how often the rent is due. So if I pay monthly, I would be on what's called a monthly periodic tenancy. If I pay weekly, it's that I'm on a weekly periodic tenancy. The idea is that it keeps rolling from week to week or month to month. Your landlord can end the tenancy at any time during the first 6 months of the tenancy, and they don't have to give a reason. It's not like the fixed term tenancy. If I've signed into a contract for a year, the landlord can't actually end that fixed term tenancy. But within the first 6 months of a periodic tenancy, you don't have Part 4 rights, or you don't have security of tenure under Part 4. And that is because it takes 6 months for those rights to kick in. So as I was saying, a landlord can evict you without any reason. They still have to give a valid written notice, and they also still have to give the minimum period, which is 28 days. After 6 months in a periodic tenancy, similar to the fixed term, you automatically get security of tenure. But unlike the fixed term tenancy, you don't have to write to the landlord to say that you're basically you want these rights, it just rolls, you just automatically have them. So that's kind of the two main tenancies. Another tenancy is what's called a Part 4 tenancy. Now, regardless of having a fixed or a periodic tenancy arrangement, all tenancies, every single one of them, become what is called a Part 4 tenancy once you're in occupation for more than 6 months. So when I talk about Part 4, all I'm talking about is Part 4 of the Residential Tenancies Act. So the rights are named after the specific section of the Act. And this part of the legislation basically just details the security of tenure. So how long you can stay in your property, and it also has specific circumstances under which your tenancy can be terminated. So the rights in a Part 4 gives you, I think I have a typo there, sorry. The rights in which Part 4 of the Residential Tenancies Act gives you are generally referred to as your Part 4 rights. Yeah, sorry, tongue-tied. So yeah, it's a Part 4 tenancy or Part 4 rights or security of tenure. That's what you'll hear people referring to it as. And just to swoop this little video over here. After 6 months, you can stay in your home for a number of years. If your landlord wants to evict you or terminate the tenancy after those 6 months, they have to have a really specific reason. And those reasons are detailed in the Residential Tenancies Act, and we will also be covering them in the next video. Initially, we were going to cover tenancies and terminations together, but terminations is quite broad, and I think it deserves that that time to just get that little bit more detailed with it instead of rushing it in here. So after 6 months, depending on how much security of tenure you get, whether it's 4 years or 6 years, will depend on when your tenancy started. So if your tenancy started on or before the 24th of December 2016, the period is 4 years. So you will be able to stay in that property for 4 years unless your landlord serves you with a valid notice of termination. And that valid notice of termination also details very specific reasons as to why you have to leave. If your tenancy then begins after the 24th of December, so basically the 25th of December, that period is 6 years. And that's because of the amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act that happened in 2015. They came into effect in 2016. So, ta-da! Claiming, as I was saying, on the fixed term tenancy, you have to claim those rights. So I'm in a property, as I was saying, I go down, I rent a lovely property out in Summerhill, and the landlord says to me, okay, I want you here for a year. I'm going to get you to sign a fixed term contract for 1 year. And I say, hallelujah, that's brilliant. That means that I can't be evicted for a year unless I breach my obligations. So basically, at the end of that year, technically by the nature of Part 4 security of tenure, it kicks in after 6 months. So by the very nature of me staying in that property for over 6 months, I have now incurred Part 4 rights. But on a fixed term tenancy, I have to notify the landlord that I want to stay on. So basically, it's coming up towards, say I start my contract in January, and it's now coming up to January in the new year. Within those last 3 months of the expiry of the fixed term notice, I need to basically just write to my landlord and say, hey, I want I'm going to be staying on in the property. I have Part 4 tenancy rights, and the reason why you have to basically notify the landlord is because they may incur financial losses. I don't know what they would be, but if you didn't notify the landlord, of your intention to remain in the tenancy, you might actually be liable for any financial losses that that landlord has faced. So here you can see a sample letter that we've done out, and essentially it is what you can use as a template to write to your landlord. So you put the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, the section on claiming your Part 4 rights is section 195. So you put the date on it, make sure it's dated, and dear whatever your landlord's name, Joe Bloggs, in order to comply with the notification obligations set down in section 195 of the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, we depending on whether it's a group collective setting or just your own personal, you're only renting on your own, are writing to you to inform that we intend to remain in the occupation. So put the address there of where you're staying after the expiry of the current fixed term tenancy. And then yours sincerely, just name the tenants there, just put your signatures on that. So that's essentially how you claim your Part 4. It's not difficult. You just kind of need to remember that to send that letter, you know. So this is just like a little visual thing because I'm a visual learner, and I know sometimes when you're talking about like timelines and stuff like that, some people are able to get it from reading it and some people need a little bit of a visual diagram going on. I'm one of those people, so I tend to put them in the presentations. So Part 4 tenancy, as we were saying, the 24th of December and before. So if your tenancy started before the 24th of December 2016 or on the 24th of December 2016, this is what your kind of cycle of your Part 4 tenancy will look like. So the 24th of the 12th, sorry, I just keep pointing at the computer when I should be doing this. 24th of the 12th, 2016 is the start of the tenancy. So if it's a periodic tenancy, or even a fixed term, like you will acquire those Part 4 rights on the 24th of the 6th, 2017. So that's when the Part 4 rights kind of kick in. So then you swivel around then to 24th of the 6th, 2017 to the 24th of the 6th, 2018. So that's kind of your second year in your tenancy, or like 6 months to a year in your tenancy. You're going to be carrying those Part 4 rights with you all the way through to 2018 and then all the way through to 2019. Now, at the end of the Part 4 tenancy, where you have your 4-year cycle, when it ends, a new tenancy starts, and it automatically starts, and that's known as a further Part 4 tenancy. You do not have to do anything if you remain in the property after that 4-year cycle. You just automatically go into a new Part 4 tenancy. Okay. When it comes to termination of Part 4, we will be discussing that in the terminations video. All you need to know for now is that you will automatically go into a new cycle. Now, because of the amendments, those people or those tenants who are on a 4-year cycle, they'll basically, when you're going into a new cycle, you'll enter into a 6-year cycle, because the amendments now basically work the Part 4 rights in 6-year cycles. So people coming out of a 4-year cycle will go into a 6-year cycle. And that's as easy as I can explain it. And then we have Part 4 tenancy, what it will look like if you started your tenancy on the 5th of December 2016 and after. So any new tenancies that have come after that date will all be on the 6-year cycle. So there you go. You have your tenancy starting on the 25th of the 12th, 2016. The Part 4 rights happen 6 months later, so in June. And then the 17th to 2018, that whole year you're carrying Part 4 rights. From 2018 to 2019, you're still continuing to carry your Part 4 rights. From 2019 to 2020, and 2020 to 2021. You have your Part 4 rights basically all the way through there, from June 2017 up till June 21. Again, when the 6-year cycle ends, if the landlord hasn't notified you, you just automatically continue into a new 6-year cycle, and the tenancy, the Part 4 tenancy, will last for another 6 years. So happy days. And then when it comes to exemptions of Part 4, so as we were saying, most aspects of the Residential Tenancies Act will cover your tenancy, but there are some exceptions made with regards to the application of Part 4. So earlier on when we were saying, if you're renting a self-contained flat in your landlord's house or apartment, the landlord can basically, even though you're covered by the Residential Tenancies Act, the landlord can opt out of giving you Part 4 rights. So if like your space was originally part of the main house, but now it's a self-contained unit, your landlord can opt out of those Part 4 provisions. And if the landlord wants to do that, they have to notify you of this in writing before the start of the tenancy. If not, you can basically just, like, if they haven't notified you, like, you will then be able to incur Part 4 tenancy rights. Like, they have to actually physically opt out of it. So if they don't opt out of it, or if you don't get anything in writing, you can basically rest assured that you have Part 4 tenancy after the 6 months. When it comes to housing associations, there's certain types of provisions, transitional dwellings. So that might be like a short-term accommodation, or it could be something of a transitional nature where you're only in it for a short amount of time. You will not get Part 4 benefits or Part 4 rights. And the same with student-specific accommodation. Even though there's other parts of the residential tenancy legislation, even though other parts of the residential tenancy legislation was extended to cover those tenancies in July 2019, the Part 4 rights actually don't apply to people and students living in student-specific accommodation. So that is something that we still need to lobby for. We still need to be asking for that, because students should be afforded or awarded the same protections as any other tenant, you know. So that's kind of it on exemptions. And when it comes to our next presentation, so what's next? We covered today simply tenancies. So I hope after this video you will be able to know a little bit more as to what a tenancy is, and also what it covers. So it's private residential tenancies. Also the difference between a periodic agreement versus a fixed term agreement. And then the main thing is around security of tenure, Part 4 tenancy rights. When it comes to the laws on residential tenancies, landlords, approved housing bodies, anyone who lets student-specific accommodation, they have to follow certain procedures before asking you to leave an accommodation. So it doesn't really matter what type of tenancy you're on. When it comes to terminations, there are very specific protocols that need to be followed. And this is what we're going to be discussing in the next workshop, online workshop. We'll be answering questions such as, how can my landlord terminate my tenancy? What kind of notice must I be given if my landlord is trying to terminate? And I'm on a Part 4. Can my landlord evict me? Or what are the specific circumstances in which my landlord can ask me to leave? So they are quite important questions. And again, I did want to give them as much time as possible. So that's why we're kind of cutting this video in half. In the meantime, if you guys need any further resources, these are kind of the main provisions available to tenants. I went through them on the last video. We have ICON is ourselves, like we're a community development organisation. We're based in the Northeast inner city. We cover community and tenants issues, and we work from principles of community development. So our aim is mainly to equip people with an awareness of their rights so that they feel empowered to challenge issues that affect them and their community. We also have the Citizens Information, and that is a statutory body which supports the provision of information, advice and advocacy on a broad range of public and social services. Citizens Information are like their website is very up to date, and they do provide great information that is easily accessible, like the language isn't too difficult, so they are a great resource. Mercy Law Resource Centre is an independent law centre and registered charity, and they provide free legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless in the areas of social housing and social welfare law. So people who are on social housing supports may and have any questions or whatever like that, Mercy Law is also a great organisation to get in contact with. We also have Threshold, who is a registered charity, and they provide independent advice and advocacy services to tenants and private rented, and they also lobby and advocate as well for changes to rental legislation. They're doing a lot of work as well on basically putting a right to housing in the constitution. So I definitely give their website a look. CATU then is a new organisation. It's they're actually a community-based union, and they seek to bring fellow tenants and community members together to combat common problems in local areas. They are a union that's outside of the workplace, which is going to be very important moving forward. So any tenant or community member can join CATU, and the idea is that they're going to be setting up local branches. So yeah, they're the resources that are available to tenants, all great organisations, and I really do recommend that you give their websites a look. And that concludes the presentation on tenancies. Again, this is our contact details. Do let us know if you have any questions. And again, we do endeavour to put out the most factual information. So if you've seen any mishaps, please let us know. And on that note, I am so delighted that we're after getting to the end of this, because no joke, I think I recorded it about 50 times again. But I'm going to love yous and leave yous. Thanks and good night.